Okay, thank you all for coming back. It's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Stephen Palmer from the University of Berkeley in California. The title of his keynote lecture today is Aesthetic Science and Ecological Approach. And I'm not going to say anything more. We all know Steve anyway. And I know he has lots of things to say, so we're going straight into the keynote.
Thank you very much, Marco. And thank you and also the other organizers for inviting me to give this presentation. It's sort of my first opportunity to try to put together in a hopefully fairly coherent package a lot of the work that I've been doing over the past decade that I consider to be part of aesthetic science. Now, the first thing, I guess, this is to remind me to say that although I don't consider myself to be an artist, I am a photographer, and that's really what got me into this field, trying to understand something about why I like the pictures that I did. That's one of my photographs. The other thing that I want to remind myself to say is that this ecological approach is not something that I started out with. I went into this project very much as an experimental psychologist, a psychophysical vision scientist, who was expecting to find neat, lawful regularities using those kinds of approaches. The ecological approach is something that the results simply forced me into. So what I'm going to be telling you, or trying to tell you today, is about how I reached that point and why I think it's a potential solution, maybe, to Alexis's problem, what he called the Gestalt catastrophe, nightmare, that's right, yes. So we'll get to that eventually. So my basic plan is that first I want to make some comments about what I take to be aesthetic science, which may not be what you take to be aesthetic science, and make some distinctions that are important. Then I'm going to talk about this fairly extended research project that we've done on single colors, only a portion of which I'll be able to talk about. Then another project on the spatial composition of pictures within frames. You can see where my photography comes in here. And then some more general issues about the notion that aesthetic preference can be talked about or understood as good fit within a context and what that means, and some experimental demonstrations that we've made. So first off, aesthetic science. What is aesthetics anyway? And I really think there's two fairly distinct conceptions around. I've noticed it in the first session already. There's what I call capital A aesthetics, which is tightly connected with the philosophical field of aesthetics. I'm not going to be saying much about that. Then there's a lot what I call small a aesthetics, which is what I do. And it's very much concerned with human preference. It's hard to find a good definition of aesthetics. This is one of them, the study of the mind and emotions in relation to the sense of beauty. But then there's the question of what is beauty. So you haven't really defined aesthetics if you don't know what beauty is. For me, it's not really, beauty is this supposed or imputed property of objects, but I don't think that's what aesthetics is about. For me, anyway, it's a dimension of human experience. It's very much about this ugh, yuck, I hate it, to wow, I love it kind of experience that we have, and they matter. It is a human experience. It's not something that's in the object. It's a response that a person has to an object. Why does it matter? I don't have to tell you that it matters in artistic domains like painting or photography. Those are a few of my photographs. But it also applies to things that don't count as art: home decor, travel destinations, eye candy, people you like to look at, and all kinds of choices that we make every day in our lives. So, for example, do I put flowers on the dinner table or not, and if so, what kind? If I want to get from A to B, do I take the fastest route or the scenic route? Do I wear a hat if I'm having a bad hair day? I don't have much hair anymore, but if I did. And at a restaurant, are you going to sit at a table where you're facing the garden or facing the street? Those are all aesthetic choices in my view, and they have virtually nothing to do with art. So the first caveat with respect to aesthetics and art is that they're different because works of art, it may include objects that are aesthetically pleasing, but there are all kinds of aesthetically pleasing objects that just don't count as art because they're not human artifacts. So, for example, landscapes, people, animals, and flowers, by almost anybody's definition, would not be art. Once you take a picture of them, once you paint a picture of them, then they're art. But the objects themselves, which I think often people have strong aesthetic responses to, are not art objects themselves. And I trust when you see the kinds of experiments I do that nobody will mistake our stimuli for art. The other thing which was just talked about by Klaus Christian Carbone and Robert Pepperell is that aesthetics is not the same as art and is not the same thing as beautiful. There are lots of examples of fine art that most people do not find beautiful, and there are corresponding everyday objects that are not beautiful. My belief is that people have aesthetic responses to virtually everything all the time. We don't pay attention to those responses unless they're fairly extreme. The ugh, yuck that I felt when I saw that cathedral that you have out there that looks like one of those old space capsules with a crown on top. I got an ugh, yuck from that one. To, oh wow, when you walk into a wonderful building with a fabulously huge and beautiful atrium, that's the other end. But it includes lots of stuff in between. And we do have aesthetic responses to art, and they're relevant to what art is and how we should be talking about art. But it's different enough that I think that this is a different study from what I would call the psychology of art or the scientific study of art. Now, in my approach, preference is primary. What I'm really almost always going to be studying is this yuck to wow perceiver preference in response to something. So this is the core of aesthetic response for me. That doesn't mean it's the only thing. There's lots of other things that influence those preferences, and we've had some people talking about some of those things today: ambiguity, typicality, familiarity, and so forth. And a new one that I just added in response to a talk earlier today was interacting with a robot can influence your perceived preference for pieces of potential art. Now, one thing that I hear from people when you say you're going to talk about aesthetic science is, well, that's not even possible. That's an oxymoron, because science is objective and aesthetics is subjective, and science is lawful and aesthetics is whimsical. We have these expressions like there's no accounting for taste, beauty is in the mind of the beholder, all of which seem to imply that you couldn't have a science of aesthetics. And I want to claim that and offer this talk as an existence proof that that's not true, that in fact you can have a science of art. And I think that approaching it from the perspective of an ecological framework is a useful one. There are at least 3 different kinds of approaches that you can take to aesthetic science. And the one that we are most familiar with, I think, is a normative one in which critics and artists try to say what it is that people should like. I would consider Arnheim maybe to be part of this, even although he's sort of in between. But there's also an empirical approach, which is descriptive and trying to find out what it is that people actually do like. And I think that most people at this conference would be most interested in that. But there's also this third part, which is theoretical, which is why is it that we like the things that we like? I mean, you run into the empirical study of aesthetics, kind of the title of that domain almost implies that we have no business making theoretical claims. But in fact, there's no reason why we can't. And I'm going to offer several examples in this talk of theoretical explanations why it is. Once we know what it is that people like, then we can make a theory about why they like them. All right, so the first content topic I'm going to talk about is preferences for single colors. First, I have to say a few words about color experience, how it gets talked about or how it can be talked about in terms of a 3-dimensional color space. I'm hoping most of you know this, so I don't have to dwell on this at all. But there are basically 3 color dimensions, one of which is called hue, the sort of basic color, which has sort of 2 dimensions within it, red versus green and blue versus yellow. What happened to blue versus yellow? Well, it's in here. It's not there. Oh, it was. Well, I don't know why I disagree. Anyway, red versus green, blue versus yellow are these 2 dimensions within hue. There's saturation, sometimes called chroma, and there's lightness, which is sometimes called brightness or value. I'm not going to get into those distinctions. So within that three-dimensional space, we started out sort of as good psychophysicists. We wanted to sample this space in a relatively systematic and uniform way. So we picked 8 hues, the 4 so-called unique hues of red, green, blue, and yellow, and then the combinations of those pairs, orange, purple, cyan, and chartreuse. And for those who don't know this, that color there is the one that I'm going to be calling chartreuse, and that color there is the one I'm going to be calling cyan. And we chose each of those 8 hues at 4 different what we called cuts through this color space. There's the saturated cut, which is the one that I've demonstrated already. There's a light cut, which are the same 8 hues, sort of halfway between the saturated cut and white. There are the muted hues, which are halfway between the saturated cut and neutral gray in the middle. And there's the dark ones, which are halfway between the saturated cut and black at the bottom. It's not completely uniform, but it's a reasonably good one. And these constitute the 32 colors. There they are in an array, as we'll use them in some of the experiments. And there they are represented for those of you who like CIE lab color space. So when we ask people to rate the colors, their preferences for the colors, what do we find? We actually have them sit in front of a monitor. They see a square of the color on a neutral gray background, and they use a slider scale that goes between one end, which says basically I don't like it, to I like it very much. So when we look at the color preference function for the light colors and for the muted colors, they're virtually the same. The obvious facts are that people tend to like the cool colors, that is cyan, blue, and purple, more than they like the warm colors, red, orange, yellow, and chartreuse. But there's this funny little blip at yellow, which we'll get back to later on. And then there's the response, there are preference responses to the saturated colors, which is basically just a main effect. This is all people in the US, and actually in the Bay Area. They tend to like saturated colors better than correspondingly hued light and muted colors. So far, so good, very regular. Doesn't look like we've got some big Gestalt problem. But then we look at the dark colors, and all of a sudden we find these very large interactions. There are certain colors that, yes, welcome to the mini Gestalt nightmare. This is what Alexis was talking about. If you take a bunch of dimensions, put them together, you get interactions between the dimensions, and then you have to be studying Gestalts. So these are the three, the light, dark, and the light, muted, and dark colors are the ones that have the same degree of saturation. And what you find there is that dark yellow is particularly disliked, and dark orange also, which you would sort of call brown, and I call dark orange yucky poo, because that's sort of what it looks like. But the dark greens people like better than the other greens, and the dark reds they like better than the other reds. So some are liked more, some are liked less. Why might this be? When we first got this data, when I talked about it, I gave a just so stories. Well, I say, you can understand this. We like saturated blue because it's the color of clear sky and clean water. We like saturated cyan because it's the color of swimming pools and tropical oceans. We like dark green because it's healthy vegetation, and dark red because it's ripe fruit. And we don't like dark orange and dark yellow because they're the color of biological waste products and decomposing food. But that's a just so story. We're cherry picking particular examples. We know we like this color, and so that's why, or we know we like these objects, that's why we pick that. So in order to actually test this idea, and notice this is the beginnings of an ecological theory, it's saying that maybe our perception and preference for colors is actually based not on some psychophysical low-level description of colors, but the objects that are those colors. And I'm offering, I said that maybe not, I added, oh well, at the bottom it said maybe not the Gestalt nightmare, because I'm offering this as a possible solution to the Gestalt nightmare, which is that in the Gestalt nightmare, the idea is that you have to, if you take a high-dimensional space of colors and textures and shapes and so forth, that you get all kinds of interactions, But that's because you're presuming that there's going to be some linear combination of these things, but there's particular points in that high dimensional space that correspond to real objects, ripe strawberries and ripe bananas and poop and so forth. And maybe it's really about aesthetic response, is really about your response to those objects, which are essentially singularities within that high dimensional Gestalt nightmare. Okay, so maybe it's not such a nightmare if we start looking at it in terms of the objects rather than in terms of the psychophysical dimensions. Okay, there's at least four different kinds of explanations you can give for color preferences, and you can think of this as a sentence, I like this color because. You can give a psychological explanation because of the way that it makes me feel. It makes me feel happy or clean or whatever. You can do it physiologically. You can say it's because of the appropriate neurons fire in particular ways, like cone contrast or something like that. You could have an environmental theory, which is you like it because of how much of that color there is in the world, sort of a familiarity or fluency kind of idea. Or, and this is the one that's of most interest to me here, you could do it in terms of an ecological relationship between an organism and things in the environment. I like the things that are this colors. That's the reason why I like the color. And I want to include both physical and sociocultural surroundings in the ecology of the organism. And I'm going to be talking about contrasting two different kinds of theories about these color preferences, one physiological and one ecological. There's other ones that I'm not going to talk about, but I haven't got much time. So the physiological account I'm going to concentrate on is this cone contrast theory by Hurlburt and Ling. And it basically says that you like colors to the degree that they activate these cone-based contrasts for the color against the background that are based on the short, medium, and long wavelength cones that exist in the retina. Very, very physiological. The ecological account that Karen Schloss and I came up with it's a wonderful one-sentence theory. It says people like each color to the degree that they like all the things that are associated with that color. It's a very simple statement, but it's a very complex theory because of all the things that there are that are various different colors. And of course, how do you go about testing that? So the genesis for this idea was by analogy with other kinds of preferences. What are preferences for? And my idea was that, well, preferences are for steering an organism toward things that are good for it as opposed to things that are bad for it. So why do we like to eat the things that we like to eat? Well, we've got these taste receptors. And what they're telling us is that you should eat sweet, fatty things because those taste good, and you should not eat bitter, sour things. And as long as there's a correlation in the world between the things that are sweet and fatty and the things that are nutritious for us, and the things that are bitter and sour and those things that are toxic for us, then it will steer us in pretty much the right directions. And we can use learning to tweak it so that we get the best of all possible worlds. The analogy is that organisms may have some better success if they're attracted to good-looking stuff and repulsed by bad-looking stuff, including the colors of those things. And I want to include that there could be both genetic, that is to say, evolutionary determinants of this, although I suspect they're fairly weak in humans, but also a learned component that's based on conditioning and learning mechanisms of some sort that provide an adaptive mechanism. So let's look at those color preferences that we measured. We can actually try to predict those from this cone contrast model because we know what the outputs of the cones are. We have good models of those things. And then we can just look. This is a linear kind of prediction. And we find out that we can predict 34% of the variance in all of those color preferences I showed you according to this model. But we need 3 parameters to do it, one for each of the weights on each of the cone types. But then how are we going to compare that to this ecological theory? How can we measure the predictions of the ecological valence theory? Well, this is just to remind you what it is. But then these are those cherry-picked examples. So what we need to do is find a procedure where we can get all of or as many as we can, of the objects that are that color and look at it systematically that way. So we came up with this procedure, has 4 different components, and we have different groups of subjects to each of these tasks, at least we did initially. The first group I've told you about already. They rate those 32 colors for preference. A second group comes in and they see exactly the same colors, but instead we just ask them to write down a very brief description of all the things that they can think of that are that color. So for this saturated cyan, they might say swimming pool, tropical ocean, fish tank, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know what all, well, we'll see in a minute what they are. Then we take those descriptions, and there's lots of them, and we have to sort of compact them down into 222 object categories, and we get another group of subjects, and we just give them the description of that category in black text on a gray background and say, how much do you like these objects? How much do you like tropical oceans? How much do you like swimming pools? How much do you like fish tanks? And then we have a fourth group of who come in, and they actually rate the similarity between that color and the color of the object that's named. And the reason for this is that we want to sort of, psychology subjects will say anything, and you want to downweight the things that are bad color matches, and you want to upweight the things that are good color matches. So what do we do with these data? We calculate something that we call the WAVE, which stands for the Weighted Affective Valence Estimate for a given color C. And so we have a list of all of the objects that people, of these categories of objects that people have named for this color. And for each one of those, we have the average valence, how much people like it or don't like it, for each one of those categories. And then we have this match score for how well that category matches this color. We just take the valence score times the match score and compute the product of those things, and then take the average of all of them. So this is an embodiment of the idea that your preference for this saturated cyan is essentially the weighted average of your preference for all the colors all the things that you know about that are that color. And I should add that we had to say two other things in the instructions to subjects giving the descriptions. One is, don't bother telling us about things like crayons or paint or wall color or tie color, which could be any color. We don't want that. And if we got any, we threw them out. The other thing is we had to say, please don't be afraid to say things that you might think are negative or gross, because people tend to inhibit saying things like poop or vomit or so forth. And if you do all of those things, and then you get a WAVE score for each of the 32 colors, and you've got a preference score for each of the 32 colors, then you can correlate those two things. And it turns out the correlation between those two is about 0.9. And you're accounting then for 80% of the variance in the color preferences, and you're doing it with no free parameters. There's 1 million parameters, but we're estimating them all experimentally. We don't have any weights that can be fit by regression or anything like that. This was a total surprise to me. We actually engaged in this experiment to show that it was wrong, and the results blew me away. That's the data for average subjects. What do the data look like for individuals? Well, as you might imagine, things are a little bit messier. So we wondered whether there was a way in which we could account for any portion of that individual difference variation in this ecological valence theory. And it says that individuals will have different color preferences to the extent that they have different preferences for the same object. If I love broccoli and you hate broccoli, then I may like dark green better than you like dark green, for example. Or if they have different experienced objects. That is, Japanese subjects almost always mention tatami mats for light yellow, and American subjects almost never do. So both of those things can influence people's responses, and it makes a very simple prediction, which is that my wave will predict my color preferences better than your color preferences, and your wave will predict your color preferences better than my color preferences. So in this little diagram, it's that the directly upward solid arrow correspondences will have higher correlations than the between subject correlations. And we do the experiment that I just told you about, except that we do it with the same subjects for each task. And by the way, it turns out that the results are essentially indistinguishable from when you do it with 4 different groups of subjects. So the data look like this. We had 48 subjects, and you get this big 48 by 48 correlation matrix. And the values along the main diagonal are the within subject correlations between the waves, which are on the left-hand side, and the colors, the P wave just stands for personal wave, and the color preferences for the corresponding subject. That's the within subject measures, and there the average correlation is, I think it's about 0.55. And when you do it for all the uh-oh. Heart failure. Let's hope that doesn't happen again. If you do that for the between subject correlations, it's a good deal lower, about 0.39, I believe. And you can actually do a little bit better than this. This is just with exactly the same objects for both the within and between. We also did it where we allowed people to add idiosyncratic objects where they could say, this is the color of my grandmother's quilt, which nobody else would know the color of, but they might have very strong reactions to, and that brings the correlation up to about 0.6. The average correlation, this is, between preferences and waves within the individual. So it seems that you can, in fact, account for some, but not all, of the individual differences. And we looked at some other predictions of the ecological valence theory, one of which was about learned social effects. So it predicts, for example, that people who are positively invested in a color-associated social institution should like its colors more than people who are negatively invested in it. And the Bloods and the Crips are United States gangs. The Bloods are, as you might imagine, positively associated with red, and the Crips with blue. And the Bloods love red, they hate blue, and the Crips love blue and they hate red. In fact, they kill each other over this stuff. So we didn't want to bring them into the lab, so we did the next best thing, which is to study Berkeley, Stanford students, where there's a strong rivalry between Berkeley and Stanford. And we actually did the study not long before what's called Big Game, which is the Berkeley-Stanford football game when the spirits run highest. So what we did was we brought people into their respective universities. We gave them the whole set of 37 colors in our standard battery, plus those 4 particular university colors: Berkeley blue, Berkeley yellow, Stanford red, and Stanford white, which is white. And we also did it for pairs of colors with a figure ground thing, so all possible figure ground combinations of those 4 colors. But we also included all possible figure ground combinations of those colors with 3 other color variants: a sort of muted blue, a muted yellow or dark yellow, and a muted red. Okay? So what did the results look like? I'm just going to show you the results, sort of combining all of those particular 4 university colors. So the score, this composite score on the y-axis here is essentially how much do you like Berkeley blue plus how much you like Berkeley yellow minus how much you like the Stanford colors. So the people who like Berkeley colors are going to be positive, and the people who like Stanford colors are going to be negative. And in fact, there's a highly significant difference between those 2 groups. We also did it with color preferences, and again, there's a highly significant difference between those 2 groups. But more importantly, for the ecological valence theory, it says that this should depend on how much you like the institution. How much do students like Berkeley? You might have Berkeley students who hate Berkeley and love Stanford, or vice versa. So we got people to rate how much school spirit they had for their own school and the other school, and then we plotted what their composite score was as a function of how much they liked the score. They liked the school, and in fact, there's a highly significant correlation, 0.38, between how much you like the school and how much you like the school's colors, and it's even stronger for combinations of colors, as it should be, because that's going to be a much more restricted set. So there are these socially learned differences. I don't think that these are inbred. I don't think that people go to Berkeley because they like blue and gold, or go to Stanford because they like red and white. It's something that they learn during their studenthood there. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about cultural differences, because this is something that people are always interested in. The EVT makes essentially the same prediction that I mentioned for the individual differences, that if you measure the wave in America and the wave in China, you should get higher correlations between the American wave and American preferences than between American and Chinese preferences, and you should get higher preferences for the Chinese wave to Chinese preferences than to American preferences. So we did this study, and as I already told you, this correlation is about 0.89. When we did the study in China, we got a pretty disappointing 0.59. No, it's not a catastrophe. I mean, most psychologists would be thrilled to have a correlation of 0.59. But in this particular case, it was lower. And we also found lower correlations in Japan and Mexico, but as high correlations actually in Britain. So there are cultural differences here, and we wanted to understand this. And one of the possibilities, it seems, is that there could be symbolic differences. This kind of thing has been talked about by Sato and a number of other people, that there might be symbolic and conceptual associations that differ across cultures. I went on the web, and found these lists for red. In China, red means good luck, celebration of vitality. In the US, it means love, passion, anger, danger, and stop. Whereas yellow in China means the imperial family and sacredness, and then in the US, it means happiness and also cowardice. This is where I got those data. But we couldn't take that, right? So we had to do an experiment. Well, what do you do to find out? Well, you do exactly the same experiment that we did with the objects, but now you ask people to list all the symbols and concepts that you can think of that are that color. So we have the same 4 tasks. Only here, group 2 is saying to this color, they say, well, calm or calmness and freshness and playfulness or whatever. And then we ask people to rate how much do you like calm, how much do you like playful, how much do you like each of these symbolic and conceptual things. It's a much harder experiment to do, by the way, because there are so many more of these conceptual associations, and in a way they're so much flakier, but you can do it. And when you do it, what you find is that we're looking now at the correlation between, we have 2 different kinds of waves now. We've got an object wave, and we've got a symbolic wave, or a conceptual wave, right? So when you look at the object waves, you have what I told you before, which is that you get much better correlations in the US than you do in China. But when you look at the symbolic waves, you get the opposite result. That in China, the waves, the symbolic waves, are actually better predictors by itself of Chinese color preferences than their object waves are. And in the US, in fact, they do much worse, so much worse that you actually don't even do better by combining the 2. So this is consistent with the idea that the US is a materialistic society. Big surprise, right? And that, that the Chinese are much more sort of symbolically oriented. But the objects do matter in China. You do better with both of them than you do with either one of them alone. And the 2 together raise the correlation up above 0.8. So I thought that was a lovely result, particularly because we didn't expect it. But we're glad to see it. So now I'm going to talk about, preferences for spatial compositions. See, where am I? Okay, I'm halfway through. I'm halfway through the time. Who knows? So in the spatial composition, here's a sort of, this is my only slide that has any art in it at all. We didn't do this experiment. This is for us now. So here's 2 paintings that differ only in the spatial composition. The objects are the same. And the question was, which one do you prefer aesthetically? How many people prefer the one on the right? Raise your hands. Okay, how many prefer the one on the left? Oh, wow, this is the first time this has ever happened. It's because of all these artists in here. Well, I'm sure you all know that, in fact, Whistler painted that one. You've seen it so often that you're probably bored with it. He didn't paint this one. And with most audiences, there's a fairly substantial majority. But this is just to demonstrate the experimental technique. And it, how it comes out is how it comes out with this kind of a group. People like that one. They like her looking out of the frame. So the very first experiment that we did was looking at the horizontal position of a single object within a rectangular frame. And we took a bunch of different objects, and we had a front-facing view, a right-facing view, and a left-facing view of the same object. And then for each one of those, we constructed 7 different positions. They're all the same, along the columns, for the front, the right, and the left-facing objects. And then for the same object, from the same viewed from the same perspective, that is the front-facing, you do all possible pairs of 2 alternative force choices. Then you just look at what's the overall choice probability for each of those 7 different positions. And here are the results. If you use a front-facing object, basically the vast majority of people are choosing the center position as the best possible position for this object. We call this the center bias. How clever. If the object is facing to the right, then you get a very strong left-facing bias. And if you put the object facing to the left, you get very strong right-facing bias. So these are gigantic effects. I mean, these are effects that you can get with 10 subjects. Maybe not this group of 10 subjects, but 10 subjects, undergraduates at Berkeley. And we call this the inward bias. And like I said, it's very strong, and it's very much stronger. There's a lot of research that's about whether people like the same object flipped left versus right of complex scenes. These effects are much, much stronger than those kinds of effects. And by the way, this has been also shown by Bertamini and colleagues. They call it the anterior bias, but it's actually the same thing. And that's with art objects, pictures of animals. And we've done it with stock photography and shown that in stock photographs, if there's a single object and it's facing to the left or the right, it's more likely to be more lateralized than if it's facing to the center. So then we did a separate experiment on vertical position, wondering whether maybe similar kinds of things happen. So a picture of a bowl at different vertical positions, resting on some kind of a surface here. And there what we find is a lower bias, that people like the bowl to be toward the bottom of the frame rather than the top. And if we take essentially the same kind of shape in a ceiling fixture and put it up on the ceiling, that people show an upper bias. Well, this is interesting because, in fact, it looks like another form of an inward bias, but it might be something else as well. So one possibility is this kind of facing effect, that these kinds of objects, a bowl faces up and a light fixture faces down, but it might also be a purely ecological effect, that I see light fixtures above me and I see bowls typically below me, so those are the ones that I like. That would be a sort of familiar with that particular position in the world. So to try to test this, we picked some objects, two objects in fact, a flying eagle and a swimming stingray. A flying eagle being something that's always above, but you can take pictures from it from all around, whereas a light fixture you can't get above the ceiling and take a picture from the top, or it's not a view that anybody sees. So we took the eagle and the stingray, and we simulated photographs of it from different perspectives, and the results were pretty interesting. These are pictures of the eagle these are symmetrical pictures of the eagle from directly above or directly below. And there we find the results show there's a center bias. People like objects to be in the center. But there's also a pretty strong upper bias, that people want the flying eagle to be high in the frame. Whereas with the stingray, we find also a center bias, but we find a pretty pronounced lower bias, that people like the stingray to be low in the frame. And I call these ecological biases because it's about where the objects are found in the world relative to you, the viewer. It's about the relationship between the object and the viewer. When you look at the sort of combined views, the sort of side and bottom or top views, you find also this ecological upper bias, but you also find in this crossover interaction an inward bias as well. I'm not going to go through the logic, but that's the signature of the inward bias. And the same thing for the stingray, except now you find this lower bias and an inward bias. So according to these data, we can summarize what we found, that in the horizontal position, there's a center bias and an inward bias, and in the vertical position, there's a center bias, an inward bias, and this ecological bias. So this is an explicitly ecological bias, but what I want to address now is maybe, what about these center and inward biases? Might those also be ecological effects? And I kind of think they are now. So this was a sort of wild idea that maybe the inward bias isn't really a separate bias at all. Maybe the inward bias is just a center bias, but what you're centering in the frame is not the physical object, it's the ecological space around the object, which I call the affordance space of the object. So if you want a definition, and this is nothing set in stone about this, but I would say the affordance space is the volume of space around an object that includes room for its functioning and its interactions with other objects and organisms. And this is kind of loosely based on Gibson's notion of affordances. So here's an example of how you can get both the center and inward biases out of just a center bias on an affordance space. Here's a fish swimming in a tank, and its affordance space is presumably symmetrical from right to left, so that if you center its affordance space in the frame, it's going to be centered in the frame. The object itself is going to be centered in the frame. But if you have the object, if you have the side view, now the affordance space of the object has a whole lot more space in front of it because it swims forward, it looks forward, it eats things that are in front of it, and so forth. And if you center that dashed ellipse in the frame, then you get a left positional bias just by virtue of the affordance space being asymmetrical. And the same thing in the opposite direction, right? With me? So what we wanted to do was test this affordance space hypothesis, and we did it by getting people to give us their judgments of affordance space asymmetries. So of course nobody knows what an affordance space is, so your subjects come in, you have to explain to them what an affordance space is about this interaction with objects and organisms and the amount of space that's around them. And then we gave them two alternative forced choice. Here's a dog with a front biased affordance space and a rear biased affordance space, and they have to indicate which one they think is better and by how much a representation of the object's affordance space. Okay, so they're doing this. It's not a two alternative forced choice. It's a rated two alternative forced choice, but that really doesn't matter. We do the same thing with a preference task with exactly the same pictures, except where the ovals are now replaced by rectangles that are in fact the bounding boxes of those ovals. And now they're black instead of gray. Those are the only differences between the experiment, except the instructions say, we want you to say which one of these two pictures you like more and by how much. So they would move the slider across and click on the appropriate value. So what did we find? Oh, this is just giving you some examples of these front-weighted, back-weighted, and so forth affordance spaces. And then this shows you the 9 objects that we used. We tried to pick objects that had different kinds of affordance spaces. So for example, most objects, the back is not terribly important, but for a camera it is, because that's where you look into the camera. And for most objects, maybe the top isn't that important, but for a chair it is. You sit in the chair from the top. So the experimental trials would look like this and say a preference case, which picture do you like better? And you have these, for each object, you have these 7x7 matrices that correspond to these different depictions of the asymmetries of either the preference space or the affordance space. And we have all possible pairs of these things. So this particular trial shows you a back-weighted image on the left and a front-weighted image on the right, and that gives you an entry in here that if they pick the one on the right, then this would be a positive number, or however you score these things. And then we can look at the marginal means over there as a measure of how much people like this picture for the preferences, or how much they think it corresponds to the affordance space asymmetries for this object with respect to all others. This is a busy slide, so I'll help you out here. So the neutral one, that's the affordance space that is circular and equally spaced all around. And there you see the baseball is the one that gets the highest rating for that, which is appropriate because the baseball is itself symmetrical and none of the rest are. But it's a pretty good, it's judged as a pretty good representation for virtually all of the objects. The top-weighted one is highly consistent with a chair and inconsistent with a wall clock, given that we look at and adjust wall clocks from below. A bottom-weighted one is consistent with the eagle and the wall clock, but it's generally a bad affordance space for most of these objects. The right and the left are not so great in any case, and they're not very different. But notice how strongly front-weighted most of these things are. Not the baseball, but especially for the fish, the eagle, the dog, and the human, which are moving objects, which go forth and have sensory organs and so forth. And the highest rated back affordance asymmetries are for the camera and the teapot, as you would probably expect. So people are giving us reasonable judgments, things that are consistent with what I would judge to be the affordance space asymmetries of these things. And we know now how to measure them, at least roughly. And what the affordance space asymmetry hypothesis predicts is that there's going to be significant positive correlations between the affordance space asymmetries and the preference asymmetries for the front versus back and for the top versus bottom, but not for the left versus right. So here are the data. These are the correlations for the top and bottom views. We've got preference ratings on the y-axis and affordance ratings on the x-axis for each of the different objects, pictures of objects. And what we find is that for the top versus bottom, the affordance space asymmetries and the preference asymmetries are highly correlated, 0.82. For the front versus back, they're also highly correlated, but there's no correlation for the left versus right. So this is in fact consistent with the affordance space hypothesis. Now, that's kind of all we've done with that, but we need to do some more. But those are fairly recent results. Well, what about the center? Is the center, could it be considered to be an ecological bias? And is there something special about the center? Well, there's a whole book that Rudolf Arnheim wrote called The Power of the Center, and it's about the relevance of the center of a frame in art. Stefano Guidi and I did some experiments to see whether this was sort of empirically true, simply by showing people a rectangle and asking how well does this single dot fit within the rectangle. This, of course, is reminiscent of Christoph's famous painting with a dot inside a rectangle. So people would rate how well it fits from very well to very poorly, and in each trial they would see a single dot. And here's what the data look like. Here the size and the lightness of the and color of the dot corresponds to how high the ratings were, and lo and behold, the center position is in fact by far the best fitting position for the rectangular frame. And in fact, the further away you are from the center, then by and large the lower the rating is, which is actually quite consistent with some of Arnheim's speculations. Why might it be the case that the center of the rectangle is so important? Well, if you think about it, if you're like trying to reach for something that's inside of a rectangular container, your best place to aim is right at the center. If you're going to make a saccade to an object that's a rectangle, your best saccade is going to be the one that goes right to the center. And typically, you do that. You make the saccade to the center of the object. There are some other ecological effects that I'm not really going to have time to talk about. I did some research with Eleanor Roche a long time ago on what we called canonical perspective, showing that people are better able to identify objects from particular perspectives. And it turns out that people prefer the views that are more canonical to the ones that are not. There's an effect called the canonical size effect, where similarly, if you use different sized objects, it turns out that there's a correlation between the size that people pick as the best size for the picture of the object. You like the elephant in the frame to be larger than you like the butterfly in the frame to be. It's not a gigantic effect, but it's definitely significant. Finally, I want to mention some of these two-object pictures because I think they speak to some other issues that are important about ecological versus other kinds of variables. What determines the compositional preference for two-object pictures? Some of the possibilities include balance, what I'll call ecological semantics. It might be both or neither or something else entirely. The way we did this experiment was we had a picture with a single fixed object in it, the sponge in the case of the picture shown to the right, and then people did an adjustment. They had control over the position of the second object. They could put it anywhere they wanted. When they got it where they wanted it, then they clicked. And we had these quadruples of objects that were paired in particular ways, such that there were some similarly shaped objects that were related. That is to say, the sponge is similarly shaped to the cake, and the dish detergent to the bottle of wine. Those are the related, those are the similarly shaped objects. The related ones are the ones that you would use together, the wine and the cake and the detergent and the sponge, but we also paired them in the opposite way. So sometimes you would get a picture that was a bottle of wine that was fixed, and you would move the cake around for the best position. Other times you would get the bottle of wine and you would move the sponge around to get the best position for the most aesthetically pleasing picture. So I'm going to show you what these data look like, and this is just for the ones that are on the sort of left of center, but the data are completely symmetric. So the two leftmost graphs are actually the average of the left versus the right. So far left, it also includes far right, but I couldn't fit all of the data on here. And the position of the fixed object is shown in gray there. Everybody see that? So if you've got a related object, you can think the fixed object is the bottle of wine, that people put the cake actually quite close to the bottle of wine, but they put the sponge very far away, in fact, on the opposite side. And similarly, in the mid-left position, they put the related object close and the unrelated object farther away, and the same thing when it's at the center. So there's actually three very powerful results in these data. First one is there's a strong separation bias in these two object pictures because, in fact, people never put the movable object on top of or in overlapping with the fixed object. The second one is there's a very strong semantic bias. In every case, the related objects are closer to the fixed object than the unrelated objects are. And the third one is that these semantic biases strongly overcome any kind of bias toward balance. So I can demonstrate this with the champagne bottle as the fixed object, where you have an unrelated object, the sponge. People don't like it near, they like it to be far, but it's balanced. So you might say, well, here's a principle of balance operating. But when you do look at the corresponding comparisons between the bottle of wine with the chocolate cake, people like the cake to be right next to the bottle of wine, resulting in this sort of ridiculously imbalanced picture. So what is it that's driving the semantic biases? It's ecological factors. It's where do you use these objects together? Do you find them together? Are they related to each other? And if you do, you want them to be together in the picture. And if they're not related, you want them to be far apart. And balance doesn't really do very much. There's about 4 experiments in this paper, which is published, I think, in Eye Perception. We actually kept on looking, trying to find a balance effect in our data. We finally managed to find it, but only under very small effect and under very specific conditions. How am I doing here? Oof, gonna have to hurry. So, why do we like what we like? Well, there's the ubiquitous mere exposure effect, but that's not a really very appealing answer because, in fact, it rests on this notion of infinite regress. Why do you like what you like? It's because you see it a lot. Well, why do you see it a lot? Because there's a lot of them around? Well, why are there a lot of them around? Well, it's because artists or photographers or whatever, they like those objects to be where they like them to be. But why did they like them to be there? Because of the things that they saw. And as turtles all the way down, you never get out of that with a mere exposure effect. A perceptual fluency effect is better because it's just a matter of how well you can process, how quickly you can process things. But in fact, that implies that the best images will be the most ultra-predictable ones. And Klaus Christian talked about that at some length this morning, and I agree that that doesn't seem to be a terribly productive way of going. What we like is this notion of contextual fit. And I think it's ubiquitous, and I think that it's powerful. I think it's complicated, but we should be looking into this. And the idea is that we like pictures in which the spatial composition of the image best fits the intended or inferred message. But then, of course, there's a question, what is this message? Well, I think the reason that we can get different results is because there are different kinds of messages that can either be explicitly or implicitly paired with pictures. There's a default message, which is, ta-da, this is whatever it is. This is a teapot. This is an eagle, or whatever. But then there's also other messages where you can actually get different meanings by violating those biases. So it may, in fact, be why most people in this room like Whistler's Mother looking right out of the picture rather than facing into the picture. Sometimes a very badly composed picture is a good one. And I'm not claiming that this is art, but it certainly was a good picture in the sense that it made it onto the cover of Time magazine in 2006 when the Republicans, thank God, lost control of the legislature in the U.S. And there was this title to it, The Lone Ranger. The composition fit the Lone Ranger message because Bush was out of step and too far to the right for the electorate. So We wanted to test this notion of the importance of contextual fit by using titles. This is Jonathan Sammartino and I. So we took some pictures of, I'm going to illustrate this with pictures of a racehorse, but there are lots of other pictures, lots of other objects as well, where the racehorse could be in different lateral positions. And if you give it a sort of generic title like racehorse, we were expecting that the center bias would be the best position. Maybe it would have been better if it was slightly inward facing. But that this very inward facing one, if you gave it the title dead last, it implies that the horse is lagging behind and there are other horses in front. And if you want to convey that there's all this space between this horses and the horses in front, then you would want the object to be in the far left. And similarly, if you gave it the title front runner, you would actually like the picture most with the horse running out of the frame, which would be the least preferred under other circumstances. So we did a 2 alternative force choice with these titled images. Sometimes the titles were the same and the images were different. Sometimes the images were the same and the titles were different, and sometimes both were different. We just looked across all of these possibilities and got people's empirically rated preferences from the 2 alternative force choice. And when the title was racehorse, the preferred position for the object was in the center, as we expected. And when the title was dead last, then the preferred position was in the far left, and when it was front runner, the position was in the far right, running out of the frame. And as I say, this is data from all of the different objects we used. It's not just that one picture. So what this shows is you can actually reverse people's preferences for, and wildly so. I mean, hugely. You're actually, the one that's the least favorite is now the most favorite, and the one that's the most favorite is now the least favorite by changing the title, which then we claim changes the intended meaning. Here's another one that's going to bring us back to color, which is people's preferences for colors in a musical context. So we had participants imagine that they were going to recommend colors to 4 different bands for their album covers. And 2 of the bands they were called Peace and Unity, and they were music by Celine Dion and Enya. In case you don't know, I'll show you what this sounds like. Okay? Pretty peaceful and unified, isn't it? The 2 dissonant bands were actually Skin Yard and Slipknot. They were called Friction and Chaos. And here's... Okay, I'll spare you more of that. And the colors that we used, because they're relatively equally preferred by and large across people, was saturated orange, saturated chartreuse, saturated cyan, and saturated purple. We also did it with pairs of colors that were harmonious or disharmonious, etc., but that's too hard to explain, so I'm just going to use these data. So what did we find? Well, first look at the preferences for the album covers. Here are the preferences. If you look these for the harmonious band, the most preferred colors are in fact purple and chartreuse. Purple and cyan, the bluish cool colors, and the least preferred are the warm colors, chartreuse and orange, and exactly the opposite for the dissonant bands. We also had another group of subjects do the same task, but instead of rating how much do you like these colors for these albums, we asked people just to judge the goodness of fit to the band's music, and the results look identical. So people are picking as their preferred colors for these bands the colors that fit best with the music. And if you find this interesting, there's a whole third project, which is another complete hour-long talk of research that we've done about the fit between colors and music. This is just one little tiny itsy-bitsy piece of it. And if you want to look at that, by the way, there is just an article last month that came out in an online journal called Nautilus. It's called What Color Is This Song or something. It has an interactive demo where it plays music and you pick the colors, and then you get to see all the colors that 35,000 people now have picked colors on that website. So if you want to find out about that research, and it includes synesthesia as well. Finally, all right, I'm going to try to squeeze this in. I want to talk about what we call preference for harmony. It's been claimed by people like Chevreul in the color domain that preference is the same as harmony. We wanted to test this, so we actually measured pair preferences. How much do you like this pair of colors? And pair harmony. How well do these colors go together? That's what we told people. And we also gave them this musical analogy. You say that it's not necessarily the same as your preference for colors. It's like in music. Everyone would agree that Mozart is more harmonious than Stravinsky, but some people like Stravinsky, some people like Mozart. Everybody seems to get it. We tested all 992 pairs, and here are the data. These were color figure ground pairs, and the correlation between these is quite high, 0.79. That is to say, by and large, people do like harmonious color combinations. It's not necessarily the case that they are the same thing, that they are like Chevreul said. In fact, we showed that they are not. But there tends to be this preference for harmony, but these are group data. This is averaging over everybody, right? So what happens if you break these down by individuals? Because for every individual, we have how much they like each of the color pairs, and we have how harmonious those color pairs are. So we can compute that same correlation within subjects. And what we find is that there's a huge variation with this group of subjects. It went from essentially 0 to 0.75. But notice that no single subject had a correlation that was as high as the group average. The group average was even higher than the person who liked harmony most. The question we then asked is whether it holds across other domains. So Will Griscom and I did a replication, a sort of smaller replication of the color harmony effect. We did it for spatial fit, which was the dot within the rectangle, like the research that I did with Stefano Guidi. We did it with these dot patterns, Garnerian dot patterns that I had studied some time ago. And we also even did it for musical harmony. So from highly harmonious music like this, you probably all played that at some point if you took piano lessons. To this, which is a Schoenberg piano piece. I suspect that most of you think that that's disharmonious. Now what we found was what we found in the color harmony. This is a replication. The correlation is again 0.8. But here, there's a huge range of individual differences. This is 90 subjects, 30 psychologists, 30 art students, and 30 music students. From minus 0.5 to plus 0.8. For spatial fit, the overall group correlation is 0.95, but the range is minus 0.65 to plus 0.87. For figural goodness, it's 0.47 with a huge range from minus to plus 0.8. And for musical harmony, the group R is 0.97, but again, the range is ridiculously large. Might this be a sort of aesthetic personality trait? In other words, if you like beige on brown better than orange on purple, do you like Mozart better than Stravinsky? And the answer is yeah, kind of. I mean, it's not a rule, but the average correlation between people's preference for harmony values across these domains for, say, music versus color, the average correlation is 0.6. That's ridiculously big. So there does seem to be something systematic within an individual. If you like like harmony in color, you like harmony in music, and you like harmony in these other domains, which suggests that there may be some sort of general individual difference trait in aesthetic style, which we call preference for harmony. We looked for correlations with the big 5 indices and found nothing. We also looked for correlations with sensation seeking and found nothing. We did some structural equation modeling, and as I said, there's 30 psych majors, 30 art majors, and 30 music majors. I don't have time to show you that data, but there are interesting differences. This is actually across the data. We also, across the different groups. We also got measures for each person of how much musical training they had in number of years of music and number of years of training in color and visual art and so forth. So you can actually do pretty well with a single factor model where the factor is this preference for harmony thing, and it affects all of the ratings that people make in these different domains. But you can actually do slightly better if you use a model that contains that core, but then has negative contributions from art training. In other words, the more art training you have, the more negative effect it has on your preference for harmony. Because remember, preference for disharmony is something that's going to be associated with artists and musicians rather than psychology students. And the same thing that music training has a negative bias toward, whoops, there goes, I guess my time is up. Oh, but this is the last slide anyway, so I think. My summary, here we go. So aesthetic science can provide empirical and theoretical advances, I believe. The domains that we've studied include preferences for colors and spatial compositions, and also this color and music stuff, which I haven't had time to talk about. Both of them seem to be strongly driven by ecological variables, and that means that the low-level psychophysical stuff, you may want to do that initially to make sure you cover your stimulus space, but there's going to be something special about those points in that stimulus space that correspond to objects that you know about and that you have experiences with that might be positive or might be negative, and that's going to influence your preferences for those things. Color preferences are largely governed by affective responses to colored objects and conceptual associations, and compositional preferences are largely driven by affordances of objects in relation to viewers and each other. Preferences are strongly affected by fit to a relevant context. What the relevant context is important, and you have to figure that one out. And finally, that ecological approaches to aesthetic science are very promising. I want to acknowledge my many collaborators, my funders, NSF and Google. Here are my collaborators, with special thanks to Karen Schloss and Jonathan Gardner, whose name used to be Sammartino, Jonathan, now Sammartino, then Gardner, whose name appeared on many of those papers, and all of these other people. And I want to thank, in addition, as I always do, our initial sponsor, which was Amy's Natural Organic Foods. When we started this project, no funding agency in their right mind would fund it. So Karen's uncle worked for Amy's Foods, and we paid our subjects initially with pizza coupons. So without Amy's Natural Organic Foods, which is actually pretty good stuff, I don't know whether it's available in the UK or Europe, but they were very, very helpful to us, and I have large positive affect for them, even if I don't necessarily have positive affect toward their marketing colors. In any case, finally, I want to thank you for your attention, and here's a list of at least some of the publications that are relevant to what I've been talking about today. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I spoke so fast. Chris.
Well, I really think you made a very convincing case for aesthetic science, which is exceedingly impressive. I also like the philosophical analysis you said you wouldn't do, but at the beginning you went through a nice treatment of the philosophy of it, which I have to say I thought was better than all the preceding talks that attempted to do.
There's actually, I want to mention that there's an annual review chapter that I wrote with Karen and Jonathan, where I actually do a more systematic attempt at structuring that sort of review and consideration of philosophical issues.
As you know, I've worked on the issue of the power of the censor in relation to portraits, which you didn't touch on at all. I mean, not because I did it, but it's a different kind of image. I couldn't quite see how your affordance story would apply to the fact that portraits always have the face, particularly the eyes, and the upper part of the frame.
I don't have a good story for that, but I couldn't cover it because, you know, this is my view of aesthetic science and the kind of research that I did, and I haven't worked with the portraits, so.
No, I just wanted to bring up the issue of the affordance and how, I was wondering if you did have any idea of how it would apply to portraits.
I haven't really thought about it with respect to portraits, but you do want the most important thing is to be in the center of the frame because that's where your eye is going to be drawn. And there's a lot of evidence that suggests that eyes are the most important feature of a face for identifying people. That's why people blank out, you know, the eyes when they want to not show somebody's identity. So it might, in fact, have something to do with that. But that's just a guess. I haven't done any research on that. Yeah.
The subject was mentioned in the morning as starting with Fector, the very original discussion about the golden mean. That doesn't seem to have stood the test of time, or has it? Or have you yourself tried to see it?
I haven't done any research on that. My take on what I've read by other people is that it's kind of loosely true that people kind of like rectangles that are sort of longer than they are tall. I have my own theory about that, which I have never tested, which is that it has something to do with the aspect ratio of the visual field. That if you look at the visual field, it's this elongated ellipse, and that something like the aspect ratio of that might be what's driving it. But there's other research that showed that different aspect ratios are liked for different things. So there's some research that if you look at envelope shapes, for formal notations, they want things that are even longer than the golden ratio, and that for like kids' party invitations, people like things that are closer to square than the golden ratio. So it's, again, affected by context in some way. But you can do a search on the Google and well, I mean, see, I kind of don't go there. The beauty is in the mind of the beholder. That is to say, a beautiful object is an object that I have this very strong positive aesthetic response to, and you may not like it. And as Christoph was saying, if I care more about the sort of sensory features and you care more about the conceptual features, we'll have different beautiful objects. Another important thing that's very big in photography is the social consequences that are being shown in pictures. That pictures of gritty, dirty workers, are judged to be beautiful by people who really care about showing the plight of the working person and their exploitation by the society and yada, yada, yada. So it's really what is beautiful. An object as beautiful as just an object that is being looked at by somebody who has a positive affect to it, in my view.
Can I go back to your definition, which I thought it was useful and interesting, but it was so broad that I couldn't see the difference between studying aesthetics and studying emotion. And there are some problems if it's so broad, anything that has positive balance, because then you say, okay, balance and harmony, or if we prefer harmony, there's a goodness to that. Those are all overlapping because they have positive balance. So is that a problem?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you just take the yuck to wow preference dimension is the only thing that aesthetics is about, that's too broad. But I didn't go into this because I don't have time, and it's actually in that annual review chapter. For example, Kant, who's one of the more famous aesthetic philosophers, talked about 3 different defining features, and one of them was, let's say, disinterestedness. That it's aesthetic response is something where there's not a basic drive or desire that's associated with it. So you wouldn't say that even if you're hungry and there's a large piece of cake and a small piece of cake and you systematically choose the larger piece of cake, you wouldn't say that that's necessarily an aesthetic response because it's driven by your state of hunger and so forth. And another thing that he talked about, which I never really understood until a couple of days ago when I was doing this presentation, was this free play of the imagination. It's a very famous phrase in philosophy that's associated with Kant and his definition of aesthetics, and that aesthetics is let me see if I can find it in here. This slide where I have in the beginning where I have the center, here it is, where I talk about, whoops, there we go. Where we talk about preference as being the sort of central concept. For me, what matters for aesthetics is this, and it's influenced by all kinds of other things. I'm not interested in those other things unless they impinge on preference. So I'm not interested in balance per se if it turns out that balance doesn't matter for aesthetics. And one of my problems with a lot of papers that pretend to be about aesthetics but just study balance is it would be fine if you study balance and then you show that that matters in terms of how people evaluate these things aesthetically. But a lot of people just study balance and they just presume that that's relevant to people's aesthetic appreciation. And that isn't necessarily true. And it also doesn't include the fact that some people like unbalanced things. This is the preference for harmony thing. That some people, and we can get into why that might be, but some people really like things that are unbalanced, disharmonious, et cetera, et cetera. And in that research, I think what basically is going on, because we looked at art students, music students, and psychology students, I think that there's a trait, a sort of stable trait that is for preference for harmony or disharmony that distinguishes people as individuals. And the people who have a sort of preference for disharmony are the ones who tend to go into the arts. Because if you go into the arts with a preference for harmony, and you like Bejon Brown, and you like Mozart, and so forth and so on, one of the things you find out really quickly is that your teachers don't reinforce that. I mean, I took a sabbatical and went and took art courses at a college nearby, and it was very clear there's a very strong and systematic bias against the sort of harmonious kinds of solutions. And so I think people self-select, go into those domains, and then once they get there, they actually get explicit training toward or away from harmony. Do something new, do something different, do something that's edgy, do something, right? And there's a sense in which, how does this go with the fit thing? Well, I think that there's some higher level for which somebody who's got training in art, the things that fit into the art world are the things that don't fit in terms of harmony, and that's probably a big piece. Yeah. So all of those things, like I said, it's very complicated.
Sorry,
but
there's one final quick question. No? Okay.
There are studies about the way we respond to faces, and one is that we respond to childlike faces as opposed to adult faces based on the aspect ratio, and that is transferred to, let's say, the appeal of a young woman, which is closer to the childlike face, vulnerable, naive. Would that relate to your ecological considerations in terms
well, sure. I mean, talk about something that might actually be biologically built in, something that might be evolutionarily biased for, would be the dimensions and structure of a child's face. I mean, if you don't love your children and respond positively to their faces when they're squalling and yelling when they're born, the species would probably be in a lot worse shape. I mean, I think you can make a pretty good argument that there must be something like that that really is essentially, if not built in, that it's learned during your lifetime. So I think there is that kind of a bias as well, and that's the way I would talk about it.